why are we all here tonight? Some of us are here tonight because our energy bills are through the roof. We've spent billions on subsidising private profit, and we're not doing enough to face the climate crisis and the transition to green energy. Just this weekend, more people have been putting their bodies on the streets as part of Extinction Rebellion and many others, the big one. And yet the likes of Shell and BP are still investing in fossil fuels. Private companies cannot be trusted to lead the transition. And what's more, it's often our money that is used to incentivise them to invest in the little green that they are. We need public ownership and state-led organisation now. The Labour Party has promised to set up Great British Energy, a new renewable energy generation company in public ownership if they're elected. And we know that this is a very popular idea and it has the potential to be the start of an energy system that actually works for us over profit. And this is why we need Labour's plans for GBE to be as ambitious and bold as possible. And that's what we're here to explore today. So you joining this event tonight shows that there are lots of us that find Labour's plans inspiring, but that people are watching how this is going to unfold, and people need it to be ambitious enough to face those challenges. So I'm really lucky today to be hosting with Mathew Lawrence. Matt is founder and director of Commonwealth, a think tank that designs ownership models for the democratic economy. He's also the co-author of Owning the Future and Planet on Fire, both with Verso. And he, with the Commonwealth team, has been doing really amazing work focusing on energy systems for several years. So we're really lucky to have him today. I'm going to hand it over to you to say a few words about why Commonwealth has been working so intensely on energy over the past few years.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Pascale, and hi, everyone. It's great to see so many people here. As mentioned, I'm Mathew Lawrence, Director of Commonwealth, which is a think tank which focuses on how we can transform ownership so that the economy works for everyone, not just sort of the few. We've really been focusing on energy as a key part of that over the last few years, partly for obvious reasons. It's right at the intersection of many of the crises we can see, whether it's ecological, social, the deep economic pain that many people are feeling. But I just want to sort of step back before tonight's discussion around sort of the potential and sort of the potential limits of Great British Energy in terms of the context, which is that we're at a critical juncture. We've been here before. In the 1970s and the 1980s, the UK had enormous natural resource wealth in the form of oil and gas offshore, and we squandered it. We privatized it. We used the proceeds to cut taxes for the rich, to squander at an extraordinary wealth. And compared to how the Scandinavian countries developed that through public ownership, through public control, through the stewardship of that natural wealth, we've been left with very little, but very big gains for sort of big oil. Now we've got a second chance. We've been lucky enough to get a second chance. The energy transition means we have to transform our energy system. And what's more, the UK has this enormous offshore wind bounty and indeed even solar, despite a very grey day today. So the question is, are we going to squander it again? Are we going to let, sort of this greenwashing big oil sort of own it? Are we going to let private equity? Are we going to let foreign-owned governments develop our offshore wind? Almost half of all offshore wind currently is publicly owned. It's just owned by non-UK governments. Or are we going to say, actually, Great British Energy is a vehicle to develop these common resources for the public good? To say that actually this is going to be ambitious, it's going to scale, and it's going to really anchor the transformed energy system that works for everyone. And I think the key argument in a way is that ambition is the safest argument. Our research consistently finds that the biggest savings are when Great British Energy, a publicly owned generator, really goes big. It goes bold and it goes green. So it invests at scale, and there are big cost savings there because public investment is cheaper than private borrowing, because we can make the energy system work for us, not about paying out dividends to shareholders. And we can get rid of some of those subsidies that Pascale has mentioned. So I'm really, I think the potential of Great British Energy is great, but it really unlocks itself, we think, when that ambition is matched to the sort of crisis we're in. And I think for the Labour Party, it's a really popular policy. We did some polling when Great British Energy was first announced, and almost 80% of voters back this idea of a really ambitious green energy generator, including almost 3/4 of Conservative voters. So the question is then, how do they develop that? And I think an obvious comparison for the Labour Party might be the creation of the NHS. Something that the whole nation holds dear and that they are sort of, as a party, really committed to. And just to think back into sort of 1948, if they'd have gone small, if they'd had very limited ambition, would the NHS be the thing we know, we love, we care about, we defend today? And thinking about GB Energy, there's a choice. It could go small and incremental and be an important but ultimately limited intervention, or it could be the fundamental anchor of a new energy system, a new energy democracy, which is organized for us and by us, in which energy is a public good, a green good, free at the point of use, a human right, not something that should be sort of used as a profit stream for external investors. So I think that's the opportunity, a chance to anchor a new economy that works for all of us, that puts people and planet first. But that's also sort of the challenge for all of us on this call and elsewhere, to mobilize and put pressure on Labour to take the next step beyond just the sort of outline of Great British Energy, but to really cash in on its potential as a new vehicle for a green and democratic economy. So on that note, I'm really excited, I think, to welcome Alan Whitehead, who is the Shadow Minister for Energy and the Green New Deal, and he's the MP for Southampton Test.
Very much, Matthew. I hope everyone can hear me. I've done all the unmuting, so that's good. Thanks very much for inviting me to this session this evening. Sorry, that's the division bell just gone off, so I'll try and talk through that. So as you can understand, I'm at Westminster, and what we are shortly going to be discussing at Westminster is energy security bill, which is supposed to be the bill that's putting forward the sort of green plumbing for the system of the future. And it really falls very short in terms of what we need to do as far as the path to net zero is concerned, in terms of not just getting in the new renewable low carbon energy, which, as I think everyone knows, Labour is now committed to a fully decarbonised power system by 2030. So that will require an enormous amount of investment in offshore wind, onshore, solar, tidal range, a number of other things which are quite often characterised by the present government as essentially uninvestable. That is, their method of decarbonisation is to hope that the market is going to come forward with these various new renewable plants and what have you, which can then decarbonise the system. But actually, we don't know whether that's going to come forward or not. I mean, it may be the market will deliver it, maybe the market won't. And so we could be in a position in a few years' time where we've got all the ambitions for a decarbonised system, but we simply don't have the plant that is there to actually provide it. And equally importantly, we don't know whether we're going to have the grid system in place to deliver it. And that, at present, is organised by a system of, frankly, robbery of the public, which is that the grid companies put their proposals in for new grid services and transmission distribution, and then Ofgem sits on those proposals and then decides literally how much the public is going to pay them to do that work over the period. And at the end of that period, of the public having paid for the work being done, which by and large isn't getting done at the moment, they then own the asset. So we've clearly got to change that way of doing it completely, both because it is absolutely urgent that we get the grid capacity in to make the whole system work, and then on the end of that new grid capacity, we get the renewable and low carbon energy, which is actually going to run the system for the future. That needs to be built and invested in, and then, as it were, plugged into the system to make work. So Great British Energy is, in particular, a method of guaranteeing that those things are going to happen, and that we will make sure that we procure those means of making it happen. That's both the new renewable low carbon energy and the grid by means completely different than the way that they are procured at the moment. And it will, among other things, give you a certainty that that is really going to happen, that those things really do get built, that that grid really does come on stream. And that is done on the basis of Great British Energy fronting up a lot of those investments, either individually or in partnership with other investors coming in, but on the basis of the independent system operator having the powers. And by the way, an independent system operator being publicly owned, managed in the public domain, so not run by a company like National Grid, but actually being a publicly owned and publicly accountable system of operating the system, so that the system operator will be planning what we need. We will then be procuring what we need, and that will be done substantially by Great British Energy, particularly investing in those areas which are regarded as uninvestable or not very investable at the moment. So particularly grid strengthening, particularly forms of renewables such as the tidal range, which we know has got an enormous potential to provide very secure power over a long period of time. But because it requires a lot of patient capital and so on to invest in it, hasn't got off the ground at all for the moment. So two things then about Great British Energy. Firstly, it will be funded sufficiently from the Green Prosperity Fund, the 180 billion Green Prosperity Fund, which we're going to set up in general for low carbon investment and work. It will be funded well enough to be able to head up and in some instances completely manage those new sunrise low carbon assets that we're going to need for our future energy system. And the other important point is that once it has funded and either taken equity shares or taken the whole thing on board, it continues to own them. So, and that firstly means that the profits from the ownership can then lead to further investment. But secondly, there's the prospect that because the way of doing it, as Mathew has mentioned, means that you've de-risked projects, you've got much lower cost of capital for those projects coming forward. The chances of getting those projects done at a reasonable cost and getting them done on time are much greater, and that the proceeds, as it were, from those investments are likely to be considerably greater. So you can actually bring forward a system whereby you are using the proceeds of what Great British Energy has invested in, perhaps, for example, for cutting people's electricity bills for the future in the consumer sector, provided you've got sufficient working money in the system to lead to successful further investments. You can start distributing what the Great British Energy has made from its previous investments in the public sector and for the public good. So it's not just a question of actually getting a few things up front. It's a continuing system whereby we substantially own and manage and run the systems for the future. And meanwhile, the systems of the past actually, as it were, go off the system. And so the new system is substantially publicly owned, publicly managed for the public good. And the old things have meanwhile mercifully passed away. Gas has gone off the grid, coal has gone off the grid, various other things such as that, which are a remembrance of our mineral past. But the new sunrise is going to be in the public interest, substantially public owned, and then creating its own income so it can continue its life for the future. That's the vision. Obviously, there are a lot of things that need to be put in place to make that happen. But I hope that's something that you'll think is is really in line with the times that we've got to do this very urgently. We've got to get it right first time off, and we've got to get sufficient investment in place so that the low carbon economy is completely working by 2030 at the latest, so that we can really move forward in a low carbon direction for the future, having put all those things in place at a pace, at an early stage, and in the public interest. So that's it, guys. That's it.
That's
what I think is in store. Just a question of making sure that we get there in good order.
Thanks very much, Alan. That's appreciated. So just to reiterate, Alan will be sort of listening in now, but that's Alan's contribution. So moving on to Kat. Kat Hobbs is the founder and director of We Own It, which I imagine many of you will have heard of if you're on this call. And if you're not, well, Kat is the director of We Own It. So over to you, Kat.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Alan, for that fantastic speech. It's wonderful to have you in this room and in this conversation. We really appreciate it. And I'm thrilled to have so many people on this call. I think it really shows how badly people want solutions to the climate crisis, as we also saw over the weekend, and solutions to the cost of living crisis. And it's great to hear Alan saying, that Great British Energy will own its own assets, that it will play a leading role in planning, that there's going to be serious funding. And also talking about us owning those systems of the future rather than the ones of the past. That really feels very, very, very positive. So today, We Own It released new polling by Survation, where we asked people, what would you like the profits of Great British Energy to be spent on? And the top answer was actually something that the Shadow Minister also mentioned, which is lower energy bills. Obviously not a surprise that came as the top answer. After that, it was investment in green energy. Then it was insulation and retrofitting our homes. Then it was investing in public services more generally, and then developing new green technology. So people are excited about what we can do with the profits of Great British Energy. Now, let's be clear, and I know there's been some comment in the chat, 66% of us want the whole of our energy system to be in public ownership, and that includes 62% of Conservative voters. Great British Energy is about generation. It's not the whole system, it's not the energy grid, and it's not proposed that it be a supply company dealing with consumers. But as the Shadow Minister mentioned, we will have a part of the national grid in public ownership, because the Conservative government is actually in the process of taking a part of national grid and turning it into a future system operator. So that will already be in public hands if we get a Labour government, and the idea is that Great British Energy could work together with that bit of national grid, but it's not the whole grid, and it's not about supply. So let's be clear about that. But Great British Energy is hugely important, which is obviously why we're having this call tonight. It's important because, as Matt said earlier, it's about the natural resources of the UK, our wind, our water, our solar power, and who owns and profits from them. And it's about whether we have a government that chooses to actually use public ownership as a lever to drive forward renewable energy as fast as possible. And so the Labour Party has a real choice to make, following on from the huge cheer that Keir Starmer got in his keynote speech when he said, we will have Great British Energy in public ownership. He got a huge cheer. Is Great British Energy going to be a kind of small scale operation tick box exercise? Hopefully, from what the Shadow Minister said, not. Or is it going to be a hugely ambitious new institution that's a major player on the global stage? Like, for example, Statkraft, which is owned by Norway, which is Europe's largest renewable energy producer. Or like Ørsted, which is part owned by Denmark, which is the global leader in offshore wind. That's the kind of thing that we could be doing in this country. It would make a real difference to people's lives. And the evidence also is that it's not actually a choice on the generation side. If you have more public ownership, you actually crowd in also more private investment in renewable energy. None of this is rocket science. Other countries are already doing this. And I'm going to share a couple of links in the chat about this. But when you look at the top 10 countries in terms of green transition, 9 out of 10 of them already have a publicly owned renewable energy generation company. And they're using, and by the way, no prizes for guessing the one country that doesn't have one yet, that's us. And other countries, other leading countries in terms of green transition, are using their publicly owned companies to as a tool. So, for example, while our electricity prices went up 67% and gas 129% in the last year, Norway and France used public ownership to cap people's bills. While we've got the leakiest homes in Europe, Switzerland used public ownership to upgrade people's homes, adding solar panels, heat pumps, battery storage, etc. And while in the UK, our public services have been decimated through 13 years of cuts, you've got the city of Munich, which is developing wind power on the shores of the UK and using the profits from that to invest in its public transport and its swimming pools. That's the kind of thing we could be doing. And by the way, when Great British Energy is a huge success, people are going to be starting to ask about the rest of the energy system. You know, can we have the whole of our energy, or at least the grid and a publicly owned supply company in public hands? And also, can we have our water, our transport, our Royal Mail, our NHS back, please? Because people actually want profits to be reinvested in public services, and they want a say over the public services that affect their lives and affect the lives of their children and their grandchildren. If you agree, please can you react with something to give a sense to Dr. Alan Whitehead MP, the Shadow Minister for Climate Change. Let him know how you feel with an emoji, maybe a green heart, a red heart, a light bulb, or a smiley face. And thank you again, everyone, for being here.
Thanks so much, Kat. Brilliant as always, and very clear. I'm really excited to get more into this into Q&A as well. But for the moment, trying to move quickly through an amazing panel of speakers, I'm going to introduce Mika Minio. Mika Minio is the climate and industry lead at the TUC and is an economist with transition economics. Thank you so much for joining, Mika.
Great, thanks for having me. It's lovely to see so many of you here. So yes, I work for the Trade Union Congress. I co-lead on climate and industry. The TUC, if you don't know, we represent the vast majority of unions in England and Wales. That means by definition that we are not on the left of the trade union movement. We're in the centre, slap bang in the centre, looking for consensus across all the unions. And all of our union affiliates agree, whether it's the GMB or PCS, whether it's Unite, Prospect, or the RMT, the NASUWT, the NEU, everybody agrees that public ownership of new clean power is absolutely essential. Essential so that the public can benefit and see those economic benefits from the climate transition, essential so that climate action is accelerated, and also essential so that workers are not left behind, so that we actually do see a real just transition. We'll only see those outcomes, so that Great British Energy can deliver those outcomes, but we'll only see them if Great British Energy has the right scale. So if we look at an example, in fact, Kat mentioned it already, the municipal energy company of Munich, Stadtwerke München. I absolutely love it. And I've swum in those beautiful swimming pools in Munich, and they're gorgeous. They're absolutely gorgeous. They're municipal, they're quite cheap to swim in. And they are subsidized in part, tickets are quite cheap, through Stadtwerke München owning a whole load of energy generation. They generate 5 gigawatt hours of clean power per year, including 25% of an offshore wind farm off the north coast of Wales. And that's the right scale for the city of Munich, what they've got there. The city of Munich has 1.5 million residents. The UK has 67 million residents. If GB Energy is going to deliver on the promises made to the British people, then it's going to need to be a wee bit bigger than Stadtwerke München. Either that means scaling by population from that example or other examples, or by size of economy, or by landmass, or it needs to be on a par of public energy companies from similar sized European countries. Let's say France, EDF. We at the TUC have modelled the numbers, deployment pathways, renewable deployment, capital costs, investment required, and we believe that GB Energy can build clean power, whether it's offshore wind, onshore wind, solar, nuclear, tidal lagoons, or tidal stream, and can reach the scale of EDF by 2040. It will given the right resources. 2040 because it takes time to build. Offshore wind farms take time. It'll be tight getting there by then, but everything is tight in the climate transition. The numbers that we did, we've only looked at new generation. We didn't include grid upgrades and expansion that Alan mentioned, which is also absolutely key. What we worked out to reach those targets, Great British Energy in the decade from 2025 to 2035 would need 60 to 80 billion in direct equity. It also needs to be able to borrow, also needs to be able to bring in additional finance, 60 to 80 billion over that decade. And in the first term, it needs 40 billion that it can allocate it, that it can start running with, that it can grow quickly. With 40 billion in the first term, you can build a powerful base. Great British Energy could become transformational. It can start shifting things, the economy, society, politics, similar to what we're seeing Biden trying to do in the States and going, stuff will change. With that level of commitment, Great British Energy can share the benefits of clean power for all of us. It can deliver a just transition for workers that's actually believable in, and it can create a safe climate future for us and for the next generation. Leave it there.
Great. Thanks, Mika. So the next speaker is Stuart Dossett, who is a senior policy advisor at Green Alliance, leading their work to decarbonise the power system. Prior to Green Alliance, Stuart worked at the Bank of England, focused on improving the safety and soundness of banks and the banking system. So great to have you here, Stuart.
Great. Pleasure to meet you all. It's lovely to see so many people out here this evening. I've promised I'm going to keep my remarks to 3 minutes, so I'm going to do my best to keep to that, but I've probably just eaten up into 30 seconds of my time already, so I'm failing. Sorry, Pascale. So why are we all here? We're here because the country is currently embarking on transformational change to its power sector. We are ending the fossil fuel era of electricity generation, and we're seeking to replace it with abundant, cheap, renewable energy that can power our future. As Ed Miliband said in his speech at Green Alliance when he was setting out Labour's response to the US's big package of climate act, a zero carbon power system by 2030 is Labour's North Star. And that's going to be a really massive endeavour. So estimates suggest that we need between 300 to 430 billion pounds of investment to decarbonise the power sector. So mobilising that investment is going to be one of the key challenges and opportunities of this decade. And this is where GB Energy can play a role. So I want to talk a bit about how GB Energy might be funded. And as Alan mentioned in his remarks at the outset, Labour has detailed its plan to fund 28 billion per year in green capital investment as part of its Green Prosperity Plan. Allocating a portion of that money to GB Energy as the initial capital to get it up and running, and then providing some additional capital if needed in subsequent years, is one method to grow GB Energy's capital base during its formation. As we all know, decarbonising the power sector is going to unlock decarbonisation in so many other parts of the economy. So directing funds from this pledge to GB Energy is an entirely justified use for a portion of that money. And as we all know, decarbonising the power, as if that weren't reason enough, work by Green Alliance showed that the amount of renewable energy sources in Great Britain's energy mix, the more you increase them, the more evenly new skilled work within the power sector is spread across the UK's regions. So to complement that initial capital injection from government, as Mika mentioned before, GB Energy also needs to be able to raise money from private markets that it can invest into energy projects. But I think we also need to recognise that new institutions can take time to create and settle before they're operating at their full capacity. The National Audit Office conducted a report into the creation of the UK Infrastructure Bank, which offers some lessons that can help speed up the creation of GB Energy and get it investing into new energy projects. I think it's fair to say that the UK Infrastructure Bank has been investing at a slower rate than many people hoped. And in concluding its review, the National Audit Office found that this was the result of not investing in the right specialist skills within its workforce due to cost pressures, and the fact that it had been building out its internal controls and processes before taking on riskier investments. So I think with this in mind, particularly during its earlier years, GB Energy can grow through a co-investment with partners, ranging from the UK Infrastructure Bank, for example, through to private companies. And it gives GB Energy that opportunity to build the organisation's skills and expertise while also building renewable energy at a speed commensurate with the urgency to decarbonise our power system. By building that base of less risky investment in wind and solar, for example, when coupled with managing the risk on a portfolio rather than on an individual project basis, that's going to allow GB Energy to then take on those riskier but higher reward investments, like Alan mentioned, in longer forms of energy storage or tidal or whatever it might be, these new emerging technologies that we're going to need as complements to renewables in a decarbonised power sector.
Thank you so much, Stuart. It's really brilliant to hear about your work and how the investment bank can be, how we can learn from that, basically. Brill. I hope we get time to get into this more in Q&A. I'm going to swiftly introduce Ellen. Ellen is the political organiser for the Green New Deal Rising, a youth movement rising up for climate justice across the UK to make this the decade of the Green New Deal. And we're really lucky to have Ellen Fearon today.
Hi, thank you so much. Yeah, hi everyone. It's so lovely to be here and see so many of you here as well. I'm going to try and keep this as quick as possible. Yeah, I guess I just wanted to talk a little bit about why GB Energy is actually quite a significant win for our movement, and how we can use it to make an opportunity to push Labour as far as we can. First off, we absolutely need a brand new energy company here to really spearhead the transition to net zero. I think that the creation of GB Energy, if we can push it to be as ambitious as possible, should help to support people and communities. It should help lower energy bills. It should create green jobs. And I think it's an important step for the next government in really tackling the climate crisis. As we all know, our movement collectively have repeatedly called on Labour to move back to its position of supporting public ownership of energy and other utilities. This obviously isn't fully that, but I think it's actually a significant step towards this. And from my own perspective, I think it's an important change of narrative from the Labour leadership. I think that we need to see this, and it's our responsibility to use this as an opportunity to shake the leadership and show them that this type of big ticket climate policies, they're popular, they're necessary, they're the right thing to do. And to be honest, real vote winners as well, as we'll very rapidly approach the next general election. And I think if it matches the ambition of the scale of the crisis that we're facing, GB Energy really could also be a first step in rethinking how we use our commons. Obviously, one of the hallmarks of the fossil fuel economy has been that natural resources have been completely plundered, but also privately owned. And I think the creation of GB Energy should finally allow us to see a future energy source with public ownership absolutely at the heart of it. And I think we need to focus on that as something that can be expanded as much as possible, and that we can see across other public services as well. So yeah, I guess I think we need to see this as a real stepping stone, and an opportunity, as I said, to push Labour further for energy. I think that means really investing in GB Energy the way that we see other governments in Europe do. I know some speakers have already touched on that. Labour obviously have committed to 28 billion per year in climate spending, and I think, you know, in some respects that doesn't actually get us very far unless we're using that to expand ownership for the public and for us to see it as almost a down payment on further wealth creation for public services. We need to be able to make sure that it's used as a tool for redistribution by expanding the public purse and making sure that profits made through the likes of GB Energy are put back into public services. And we need to think about that and how we make sure it's the public purse that's growing and not private interests like we've seen for decades now. I guess in that vein, I think that GB Energy absolutely needs to be part of a wider political project. I think that is what's going to determine whether it's successful in a lot of different ways. Labour have got to commit to expanding public ownership by creating a public energy supplier to stop private companies from profiting off public services and taxpayer money, like we've seen, as well as committing to other forms of public ownership. We also would really like to see, you know, the Labour Party make transformative change by taxing wealth in a meaningful way to effectively fund these policies and to take a step towards hardwiring fairness into our society by ensuring that climate action, health and education are properly funded. There obviously are huge questions about how Labour will fund these kinds of commitments. And we have the answer. You know, they could raise as much as 50 billion in their first term from a tax reform. And that's something that we're really fighting for as part of our Labour Be Bold campaign. So yeah, I guess to summarize, I think GB Energy is a meaningful win for our movement. It's something that like people have fought hard for, and I think it's something that should energize our movement and set us up to use our people power and our own level of ambition for what we want this next government to achieve, and that's how we're going to win the likes of the Green New Deal. And yeah, I guess I would just say we're now 5 months out from Labour's last conference before next year's general election. We know they're preparing their manifesto for that election over the next few months. And I think now really is the time to step up and harness our energy towards getting Labour to commit to a plan for the future that we can all believe in. And I think this is a really big part of that.
Thank you, Ellen. That was really, really brilliant. Going from very specific to really big, important picture. With that, I want to take us straight to Q&A, and we've got loads of amazing questions, so I'm really sorry we won't have time to get through all of them, but I wanted to start with a few comments that people have made, some really brilliant and beautiful ones. Someone said, GBE sounds like a good first step towards a publicly owned energy industry. Ruth says, I'm really worried that the Labour Party will come under pressure from the private sector. And Lise says, I hope green energy is renewable and is not intended to include biofuels. And someone else marks, I think Sean, a publicly owned company would have to compete with existing market players and would need a substantial percentage of the market share. So a few comments there, enough of food for thought, but I wanted to pick out a few really important questions. Colin asked, and if it's okay, I'm going to bundle them up into three. We'll do a round of answering and then come back. So we've got here from Colin, how do we stop the Tories from sabotaging and selling off GB in the long run? And then a second really important question, I think, is how does GB include an overhaul of the national grid ownership so that the benefits can indeed flow through to the population? And then we have a last one, which it's okay if Alan can't answer right now, but I think is a great question. Could Alan feed back to us about how this discussion is received at Labour HQ at some point? And maybe Mika, if that's okay, I might start with you if that's not too mean.
You remind me the first one, because I only wrote down.
How do we stop the Tories from
privatisation? Yeah, privatisation. That's absolutely key and really important. And I'm not going to tell you the proposals we're currently working up because we don't want everybody to be talking about them. Because sometimes it's better to have some things thought through and planned that you don't tell everybody so that there's less out there. I think there's an obvious element, which is you make it really, really popular and you get lots of buy-in, and that means that people are really engaged. Obviously, the Tories do things even when they're not popular, so that's not enough. There's other mechanisms around how do you get GB Energy working together with local councils and doing projects together with local councils where local councils are bought into it and effectively rely on it to some extent, and you make sure that a load of those local councils are Tory councils as well as Labour, and then obviously make it for everybody. So that can also be very useful in terms of building in more stakeholder engagement. But we know that that obviously in itself wouldn't be enough to guarantee it. Like the NHS is still there despite being whittled down and having lots of privatization being brought in from every different side. And that's partly because of the depth of the institution that has been there so long, that we engage with it on a kind of constant, regular day. It literally keeps us alive. It will be hard to achieve quite the same thing with GB Energy. Yes, it will keep us warm. It can keep us warm. It can keep the lights on. But I think we need other mechanisms as well. That would be that. On the national grid, I mean, other people can come in on national grid as well. I think the distribution grid national grid is interesting. National grid is good, but national grid is basically the big transmission, the mega pylons. The most of the grid is the distribution grids, are the grids that bring the electricity ultimately to people's homes. And those are the grid. National grid, we've got problems around the level of profit extraction that's happening and the level of lack of investment into workers. But if you look at climate investment, for example, they're doing more. Distribution networks, where really falling far behind distribution grids, and that's where also vast levels of profiteering happens.
Does Stuart, if you want to come in, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you. Just a quick one on the national grid. I guess whenever I'm thinking about whether as a country we should be taking actions or not in relation to the power sector, I kind of always try and keep two tests in my mind. And the first is, does it decrease energy bills? Will it decrease them? Will there be a noticeable tangible impact? And I guess the second test is, at least for the next sort of 10 years, is it going to speed up the rate of decarbonisation of the power sector? And if it doesn't meet both of those tests, I think we really need to strongly challenge whether it is the correct thing to do or not, and really ask tough questions of ourselves. Because I think we've got this window of opportunity to achieve really transformational change in the energy sector. And we need to make sure all of the bits are pushing in the same direction for that. As Mika said, national grid, actually, by and large, doing okay, though it's tough to build energy infrastructure, and a large part of that comes down to planning framework.
Thank you, Stuart. Does anyone have anything to add to those questions? Kat?
Yeah, I mean, just to add that, as I'm sure people on this call really feel and understand, it makes no sense to have our national grid privatised, either the transmission or the distribution. We've got a system where, we have shareholders around the world kind of profiting from a bit of monopoly infrastructure. And as Mika said, the upgrades to that infrastructure are often too slow. So that should be changed. Obviously, the situation right now is that in terms of Labour's proposals, they don't want to be buying back assets. And so Great British Energy kind of sidesteps that as a question. But, once we've got Great British Energy, we need to keep pushing, and we need to actually have those assets in public hands, because that's the normal way to do it elsewhere in Europe, elsewhere in the world. And it gives us control over that infrastructure. There isn't much benefit to private companies running it. And obviously we would have, dividends coming back into the public purse and a cheaper cost of borrowing to invest. So it is a good deal to buy back those assets. It would also be a really good deal to have a publicly owned supply company for consumers as well. And then I just wanted to touch on the question about Conservative government in the future sabotaging Great British Energy, which is really important, and lots of good stuff has been said. We need to think about how we can embed that institution in our society and in our economy. And We Own It did a bit of work a few years ago, thinking about how public service users, us, as well as workers and community groups, can have a role in kind of governance and structures to make public services stronger. And so there's a report called When We Own It, which I will just share in case people are interested in that. But I think it is an interesting question. What is there any role for us, the public in particular, to have a say in Great British Energy, or to have a sort of a role in holding it accountable for making fast progress?
Alan, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I promised I wouldn't say anything after my initial comments and just listen to what everyone else had to say, but I just wanted to come in just very briefly about the grid issue, because I mean, two things. Firstly, the grid, the importance, or indeed the crucial role that the grid is going to play in the entire renewable revolution has hardly got a mention across the piece. And it is as important as that. If we don't have a grid which can deliver our power in an efficient and timely way, particularly from onshore to offshore and distribute around the country, then the entire renewable energy ambition comes crashing to the ground. I mean, as simple as that. So getting the grid to do what we want it to do is just absolutely essential. And I think Kat already mentioned that by force of the chaos that there is at the moment, the Tories are considering setting up this independent system operator, which can actually, as it were, take the running of the high level grid out of the hands of National Grid itself. And National Grid then becomes a kit owner at that point. Now, that, I think it was Mika mentioned the question of the DNOs below the national level. And they actually do the lower grid systems across the country, really important as well, because renewables, particularly plugging into the distributed system to an increasing level, and are getting really bad service from those grid operators. So what we want to do, and we're going to try and put this into the energy bill, is actually create an equivalent of the national independent system operator for each DNO, so that you take the running of the distributed system out of the hands of the DNO and they just become kit owners as well. Obviously they've got a role in maintaining and running the system, but if you beef up what is the role of both the ISOP and the distributed systems to a planning and commissioning role as well, and you run that alongside Great British Energy, you've got a really powerful tool for making the whole thing work, firstly, but secondly, keeping it within public decision making and public hands, and making sure that the system overall has an inevitable tendency towards an increasing element of public control and public operation overall. And that's, alongside Great British Energy, what we're committed to do should we come into power at the next election.
Thank you, Alan. That's a really great point. I'm going to
and I'm sorry, by the way, Pascale, I've got to go now, so I hope I don't miss anything serious, but if anybody else has got anything they want to say apropos this call, they can certainly just drop me a line and tell me about it outside this particular call. So
thank you so much, Alan. Thank you a lot for joining. I just want to get in two more questions, which I know is ridiculous given we've got 4 minutes, but I really want to put these questions to our panel. And if you can keep your responses really short, if you also don't want to add anything at this stage, that's fine. And then we'll wrap up if that's okay. There's often this question of what about companies competing with GBE, this kind of public-private question. And I wanted to ask what the panel thinks about that, the kind of that battle, if we have to think of it like that. And I also wanted to ask, there's a great question from Robbie, how do we create a popular or even grassroots mandate and involvement for these huge projects? What ideas do we have for political strategy on this? And this is exactly, I think, why we're all here today as well, to talk about that. So if it's not too mean, I'm going to pick on Ellen this time, if that's okay to start, or Mathew. Mathew, you've got your mouth open.
Yeah, either way. I mean, I think on the grassroots of fighting, I think you need to give people a material stake. And so again, showing the benefits of GB Energy and then showing its kind of compounding benefits, I think will be something that people will be mobilised behind. Will become a political asset for Labour and the Labour movement. So I think really showing the benefits and the risks, of course, potentially doesn't act with ambition and scale, that they won't come on stream for a while. So I think there's a real worth of campaigners, grassroots organisations, Labour members, the Labour movement pushing for a front loading of that ambition as far as possible. And then that creates sort of self-generating momentum. And on the sort of private public, I mean, I think Kat gave an example in which is sort of ambitious public action tends to crowd in more private sector investment. I think that could be really useful to sort of, given the challenges to decarbonise rapidly. But I think it's also worth just remembering this, it's roughly 200 billion, according to the Climate Change Committee, the amount we need in low carbon investment to get a net zero system by 2050, another 100 billion or so in sort of to get the grid ready. So that's a big sum of money, and public investment is just cheaper to build infrastructure. It's lower cost of borrowing. You don't have to pay out dividends from that stream, and you don't have to have sort of subsidies to do something, so to encourage private capital in to do something. You can just directly do what we need to do, which is decarbonize the energy system rapidly and scale a green, resilient energy system. So absolutely, I think, you know, private investment does have a significant role within the sort of current plans. But I think on that base question of financing at scale, I think, you know, a big role for GB Energy is quicker, cheaper, and builds a more effective system.
Thank you so much, Matt. I'm really aware that, Mika, if you want to come in.
Yep, just very quickly. One thing, just from the point before, that with the networks, so the grids, the way they run at the moment, particularly distribution grids, means that renewables aren't coming on stream, and things like we hear all the time from members and trade unions who are trying to get EV chargers placed in hospitals, local authorities, all to charge electric vehicles so that ambulances can be electric. And then the distribution grid company says, yeah, maybe in 2032. And it's like, well, how do we get there if they're just not, which is the current state. And in terms of private companies competing with GBE or GB competing with others, we have to build so much renewables, so much, that GB isn't going to be pushing anybody out of the way, even if it does a vast amount, because if we built that vast amount, we're going to need it. And it's not like everybody else in Europe is going to be building in as much as needs to be, like sending it out to other countries. That's a very good thing. Also, in the early stages, GB would need to be working in partnership with other companies, because GB would be starting from scratch. And the standard process anyway for building most renewables, particularly large renewables, is that different companies work together. Ørsted, biggest offshore wind company in the world, China, except China's coming in now, they'll own 50%, and then they bring in other companies to do the other part. What would make a lot of sense is GB Energy working together with other public companies. That could be local ones. London could set up a publicly owned company. Manchester could set one up. Northeastern Scotland, bits of Cromarty Firth, where there's lots of supply chains, they could set them up. And they could also be working in partnership with public owned energy companies in other countries and doing public stuff. That's already nice. And ultimately, I think the key question to come back to is who owns the wind and who owns the sun. And ultimately, it's us, the people who own the wind and own the sun, and we should make sure that in the future we own the wind and we own the sun.
Thank you, Mika. I couldn't unmute myself because I was hearting your words. I wondered if anyone had any last words to add from the panel. Kat?
I hope we're going to finish on time. It's been an absolute delight having you all here and having such fantastic comments and questions and thoughts. And I just popped something in the chat to say that if you enjoyed this Zoom session, we meet every Thursday, 12:30 till 1, and we have our weekly webinar, and we catch up on campaigns and we talk about public ownership. So if you enjoyed this, I hope some of you might consider joining us there, and we can kind of keep the chat going and make sure to report back. And thanks Pascale and Matt for hosting.
Thanks, Kat. Yeah, another huge thank you to our brilliant speakers and to all of you for joining today. At one point, I think we were 190 of us, which is really exciting, and I think shows how many of us really care about this deeply and are willing to take action. We would love if you could share on social media the polling that we released today, tagging your MP. We're just going to share in the chat links to do that right now. As Kat already said, we meet every Thursday as well to chat about campaigning for half an hour, really quick and speedy, and I promise we actually do keep to time on that call. But in general, just another huge thank you to our fab panel and to all of you for joining tonight, and we'll hopefully see you very soon. And feel free to take yourself off mute and say bye if you feel like it, but if not, all the best and solidarity.
Take care all.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
And well done.
Yep.
Keep up the good
Thank
work.
you.
Bye.
Really good event. Thank you.
Thank you to you. Bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.